This particular video is probably going to take a little bit more than 15 minutes, I'll warn you now. The metabolism of carbohydrates does start with glycolysis, and we utilize or store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen. It's stored in the muscle for use during exercise and in the liver to maintain blood glucose. Carbohydrates play a role in metabolism or energy production at rest and during exercise. When we get to very high intensity exercise, it becomes the primary source of ATP production. However, the stores are relatively limited. As we look at our graph here, with red being the contribution to fat, the carbohydrates shown in the blue line, we'll see that as the exercise intensity, which would be at the bottom line, as you get higher to maximum, the amount of fat contribution steadily decreases to near zero when you are at 100% power or maximum oxygen consumption. Carbohydrates increase as you increase exercise intensity, and you'll see that there is kind of a crossover point right around 40% of VO2 or oxygen consumption where that change occurs, where carbohydrates become more prevalent or predominant. As a person trains, that those values shift a little bit, and you have that crossover point a little bit later. So it's important to have high storage. The more storage that you have, the better performance that you'll have for duration of time specifically. When we compare the time or the initial stored muscle glycogen, if a person is on a high carbohydrate diet, moderate carbohydrate diet, or a low carbohydrate diet, we'll see that the individual will have a lower total work time in minutes. So the open dot, the farthest to the left, that would be a person on a low carbohydrate diet, which means they have less stored in their muscle before exercise, that their work time is approximately 60 minutes. If someone is at a moderate carbohydrate diet, they have 2 grams per 100 grams of muscle, they can go about 2 hours. A person on a high carbohydrate diet, which has much greater muscle storage, their work time is even greater. So we've got, it looks like it's a continuous line. It's a little misleading here, but it's showing the relationship between beginning muscle glycogen or glucose storage and time to be able to do exercise at any given exercise intensity. But you've got the different regimens of carbohydrate loading, and there are really the protocol varies whether it's the classic, a 6-day, a classic 3-day, a modified 3-day, or a 1-day. And what you'll see is in the classic carbohydrate loading regimens, you have to deplete before you load, which is very, very uncomfortable. A person does some exhaustive exercise and they start with a very low level of glycogen, and that turns on the storage enzymes, so when you feed the carbohydrate, it loads on, it's like super saturated. What we know is that we've got really good results from just a 1-day with no exercise for 1 day, and then have 1 day of really high carbohydrate and be able to load that 10 grams of carbohydrate per kg per day. Now, when you do carbohydrate load, it is possible when you eat that high carbohydrate to you can have some bloating and some water retention, which can be uncomfortable. So this is it's a science of figuring out, or an art determining what's going to be best, but we can definitely look at eating more carbohydrate to kind of top off the reserves that we have in our muscle and in our liver. In the days leading up to a competition, we want to have familiar foods, lower fiber, good carbohydrate, maybe 70 or more, 70 to 75% carbohydrates, and consider the work that's been done, and this is shown through carbohydrate loading. Now this next slide is going to have a lot in it. I'm going to recommend that you look at it a little bit more closely in your textbook. So you have a normal, good carbohydrate diet. As you get a week before your event, you're looking at tapering, putting more carbohydrate in your tank, exercising and stimulating that uptake, but doing it at a much lower intensity. Now you're up to a day before, 4 to 24 hours. Balance, familiar foods, higher intake. And here are some values. 1 to 4 hours, 3 to 4 grams per kg of body weight. Notice again we're looking at low fiber foods and potentially more complex, not simple carbohydrates. Now this is something that needs to be experimented with, but what you might find is that a beverage may be better tolerated as you get closer to the event. So a carbohydrate beverage, one fluid before exercise, might be tolerated better. And you'll see in your book that there's some suggestions about exercise or breakfast in terms of bagel, pancakes, fruit, toast, peanut butter, whatever that person can tolerate. When you get within an hour of the exercise, it's going to be a window that is going to be determined by the athlete's preference and tolerance. Now, if the athlete is not going to be able to or will not consume fuel during their training, it's especially important to get some in closer to the beginning of the event. 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrate is thought to be a good amount less than an hour before exercise. Now, what can happen if somebody consumes carbohydrate, or when you consume carbohydrate, your insulin level spikes, which causes the blood glucose to be pulled into the cells. That could cause a rebound low blood glucose or rebound hypoglycemia. But it appears that that's not as problematic as it once thought that it was. Things to consider is low fiber, low fat, low protein, because it's going to slow the digestion, absorption, and it can also cause discomfort for the athlete. There are the delivery of the carbohydrate can be a gel, a bar, or a drink, but it needs to be something rapidly available, rapidly accessible, easily digested. And so dextrose, sucrose, maltodextrin, those gels, a beverage, something that's going to be tolerated well. It's just going to be based upon what the individual feels most comfortable with and the kind of exercise that they're doing. So that mouth rinse has been shown to be helpful when you're exercising also at a high intensity and for 30 to 60 minutes. And it's about 5 to 10 seconds of rinsing, and it can help to delay fatigue, have better performance. So it is showing that it's potentially beneficial. This shows you what happens to your blood glucose with a placebo, or if you have a beverage that has carbohydrate. And because we've got a limited absorption, 6% carbohydrate drinks are about it. If you get too high of carbohydrate concentration, your gut will clench. It is very uncomfortable, and it's actually counterproductive. So here we have our blood glucose level at the start of exercise being, if it's red, it's an individual is consuming a beverage. If they are consuming simply water, that is the blue. You could see at little over 2 hours, a person consumes that carbohydrate drink, and up the blood glucose level goes. And you can notice also that the individual could perform or could maintain exercise for 210 minutes, where the person who simply drank water at the 2-hour point, the blood glucose significantly dropped, and that's what those stars are, and they fatigued much earlier. So a carbohydrate beverage is going to have a ability to maintain that blood glucose and delay fatigue. After competition, well, it takes about 20 or more hours to get full glycogen replenishment. And the replenishment is going to be, or the enzymes are working at their fastest immediately post-exercise. So it's important to get that carbohydrate early after exercise is completed. Liquid or solid. Now, some people will want to drink fluid because of the hydration and the cooling component that goes along with it. So that is something to consider. If there is a little protein in your beverage, that's going to help with protein synthesis as well. If somebody can have chocolate milk post-exercise, then that's great too.
Finally, is there a concern about gender differences in carbohydrate needs? Well, most research has been done on men and has excluded females because of the menstrual cycle. And that has been a problem for providing a good scientific basis of how to make recommendations specifically for females. Now, because of the hormonal changes that occur during the menstrual cycle, I think it's 2006, researchers initially looked at what occurred during the different cycles and found that during the luteal phase, which is post-ovulation, about day 14 in a 28-day cycle, it begins about day 14, lasts 12 to 14 days, that the need for carbohydrate is potentially greater. And if carbohydrate loading is done during that time, that you need to be specifically aware and have particularly more, not significantly more, we don't know how much more, but more available for that athlete. The starting point is to go with the recommendations that are available, but do know that the menstrual cycle can affect training adherence, the habitual nutritional intakes, the food or taste preferences, and also gut health and function.